Laura Filon, coordinator of Wilmington in Transition, part of the International Transition Town movement, our local effort here in the greater Wilmington area. We're here for a Skillshare today to learn how to build cold frames to help extend the growing season, and we're using upcycled and recycled materials, which is all very transition appropriate because we're into recycling. The Transition Town movement is about building greater resilience and sustainability globally through actions locally, through grassroots movements. Involves community building, reskilling, working towards getting ourselves off of our dependence on fossil fuels.
I'm introducing our presenter for today, George Davis, editor of the blog From Seed to Scrumptious, and he's going to show us how to build cold frames using available materials.
But a cold frame is nothing more than a box with a clear lid on it. One end of the cold frame is lower than the other because in the wintertime, when the sun is lower in the sky, if you did have the raised box, the front of the box would shadow all the way to the middle. So when you have a shorter side that faces south, the sun, even though it's low, can get into more of the cold frame that way. So the more air that you get, the less efficient it's going to be. So you don't want a 6-foot-high cold frame. However, you don't want the front real short either because anything that touches the glass is likely going to freeze. So you're just, even if you had the cold frame and it did nothing but cut down the wind, you'd extend kale and collards and stuff because the dry winter winds just beat the bejeebers out of the things. So the cold frame will work and help to some extent that way. General guidelines I've heard is probably like 6 to 8 inches on the front and then maybe another 6 to 8 inches on the back. When you're building the cold frame, there are actually 2 ways that you can do it. This way, you've got the sloping front, but it's actually easier if you didn't. That if you had this piece that's cut in half, you just left it, and then that way your glass, you'd have a piece out here, and the glass then wouldn't have anything to rest on, which is a reason to build it this way. Now, when you build it that way, the easiest way to get the slope is that this is just a single piece of wood. So there's one half and there's the other half. So that when you cut it from corner to corner, you're going to have the correct angle for putting that on. Now, if you wanted a steeper one, you'd have to have a bigger, taller piece of wood in the beginning, or you'd have to figure out the angles, which I'm not good enough to do. Cold frames work, or the growing season works when you get 10 hours of sun, which seemed to be the magic number for any place, is that you need 10 hours of sun to get plants to grow. If you're at less than 10 hours, you're extending, you're coasting, you're just leaving that stuff out there in the ground and it's fresh. The 10 hours comes at about, I think maybe the 3rd week in November and then maybe the 3rd week in February. So after the 3rd week in November, you're not going to get a whole lot of growth, even if you put a heater in there, because there's not enough sunlight. You're not going to get a lot of growth until the 3rd week in February, because you don't have the sunlight even if you heat it. So you're not trying, none of the warm weather crops are going to benefit from it at all. I mean, tomatoes are gone, their history, cucumbers are gone. What's going to be a potential is your colder crops, but basically it's best for what you think of as a salad, because everything else is going to get too tall. I mean, yeah, you could have a cold frame that would help kale, but I've got kale in the garden. Yeah, and kale's tall and it's going to reach up and touch the glass, and whatever's touching the glass, when you get a hard freeze, it's frozen to the glass just like your fingers would be if you had them touched.
about like root vegetables? Like, are there any roots that, because they're like in the ground, that might?
It's not going to benefit any of them other than to make a nice hotel for the voles to live in. No, that's a good question, but your root crops you can store in a
In the ground.
in a garbage can. A steel garbage can is great because the beasties can't get in it. If you store them in the ground, you're going to probably have voles if they've discovered your garden. But the root crops themselves do not need that warmth because they're already in the storage mode. Carrots, you can leave them in the ground.
Yeah.
Potatoes, you can leave in the ground.
Okay.
I look at the free Craigslist a lot. And one day I saw an offering for Trex lumber, the plastic stuff. And I went down and grabbed that just as quickly as I could because it's like $100 worth of Trex lumber.
Wow.
There's some more around, but he was tearing out a deck and throwing it away. Now, the problem with Trex is the daggone stuff is heavy. And it's also quite flexible. You wouldn't think so for making decks, but it's on 16-inch centers on decks, so you don't really know it. But warping, I guess, is the best thing to think of. Now, you have to, when you're building a cold frame, support the corners. And this idea, you have the shelves that are that flexible metal stuff, and people throw those away on Craigslist. So if you get a hold of those shelves, then you can just cut them with a hacksaw and use those for the corners. Now, they're quite flexible too. So when I put this thing together by myself and I stood it up, and it's pretty daggone heavy, and it started going, and it did. And the metal just, so I had this great big flat trapezoid instead of a cold frame.
So the moral is build this one where you want it.
Yeah, or have somebody
Or
help
have
you.
somebody help you.
But
Our exchange.
the one over there, I didn't show you the rotted piece on the cedar. This doesn't rot. And I don't think the Trex has any stuff that leaches out. Because the woods that you get, I haven't found a definitive answer for whether or not you can use treated lumber in gardening. I don't know that anybody's going to, the people who think you shouldn't, if they're the manufacturers, are not going to tell you that.
I've always been warned against it
But
because of arsenic.
I would use just regular untreated pine scrounging. And then if you're going to build a cold frame out of pine, I've seen people go out and buy the expensive 8x12s and stuff like that. If you do that, I would suggest you put the 2x4 on the bottom and then put your 2x8 on top of the 2x4, because the 2x8 costs a heck of a lot more. And when your 2x4 rots on the bottom, you just take that off and put a new 2x4 on the bottom and start again, because the 2x8 that's not touching the ground is going to last a whole lot longer that
Right.
way.
Makes sense.